Behind the stone walls of the monastery of Pedralbes in Barcelona, a garden has been growing in the same soil for nearly 700 years. The nuns who founded the monastery in 1327 planted vegetables in a walled plot measuring 3,000 square meters, and those vegetables fed the community through every century that followed. Some of the plants they put in the ground came back every spring without replanting. Others dropped seed at the end of the season and returned on their own the following year. The garden required no trips to a market for new seed, no annual investment in starts, and no empty soil waiting through winter for the next planting cycle. It simply continued. This was not unique to Pedralbes. Across medieval Europe, monastery gardens and cottage plots operated on a logic that modern agriculture has almost entirely abandoned. The vegetables that fed those communities were selected for permanence rather than speed, for resilience rather than uniformity, and for the ability to return year after year from a single planting. Many of them were perennials. A perennial vegetable grows, produces food, dies back in winter, and returns the following spring from the same root system. Plant it once and it feeds you for a decade or longer. Others were biennials that self-seeded so aggressively that they functioned like perennials, reappearing each season without human intervention. These crops did not deplete the soil. Many of them improved it, breaking up compacted ground with deep taproots or fixing nitrogen through their root systems. They required almost no maintenance, tolerated poor conditions, and produced food in seasons when annual crops had long since finished. For centuries, this approach made sense. Farmers and gardeners worked within systems where labor was limited, inputs were expensive, and the ability to grow food without constant replanting represented a significant advantage. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, something began to shift. New crops arrived from other continents. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and agricultural priorities changed. Speed became more valuable than permanence. Uniformity became more valuable than diversity. Mechanization required crops that could be harvested by machine, shipped in crates, and sold weeks after picking. The vegetables that had sustained medieval Europe for centuries began disappearing from gardens, then from seed catalogs, and eventually from memory. Not because they failed, because they no longer fit the system. 7 of those vegetables tell the story of what was lost when agriculture reorganized itself around different values. Each one was a staple in its time. Each one solved problems that modern crops cannot. And each one reveals something about the trade-offs we made when we chose speed and uniformity over resilience and self-sufficiency. The first of those vegetables was so prized by a Roman emperor that he demanded it as tribute from conquered territories. By the Middle Ages, it appeared in nearly every kitchen garden across Europe. And then, within a single century, it almost completely vanished. The vegetable that Roman Emperor Tiberius valued enough to demand as annual tribute was called skirit, a perennial root that grows in clusters of sweet white fingers beneath the soil. Pliny the Elder recorded that Tiberius required a fixed quantity of skirit to be delivered to Rome every year from the Germanic territories, which suggests the plant was considered valuable enough to formalize its collection across an empire. By medieval times, skirit had become common throughout Europe, particularly in monastery and cottage gardens where its unusual characteristic made it especially useful. The plant produces a crown at the soil surface, and from that crown grows a cluster of 8 to 12 slender roots, each roughly 15 to 20 centimeters long. When the roots are harvested, the crown can be replanted immediately, and within months it regenerates a new cluster. One planting could feed a household for decades. The roots themselves were sweet enough to eat raw, with a flavor described in Tudor-era records as somewhere between parsnip and carrot, but with a natural sugary quality that required no cooking or seasoning to make them palatable. Skirit appeared regularly in English and French feasts from the 1200s through the 1600s, used in both sweet and savory dishes, and remained a standard kitchen garden crop well into the 1750s. Then it disappeared almost completely within a single generation. The reason was not flavor or nutrition, but competition from a crop that had arrived from South America and spread rapidly across Europe during the same period. The potato produced far more food per square meter of soil, required less careful handling during harvest, and presented itself as a single large tuber rather than a tangled cluster of thin roots. For a household trying to maximize caloric output from limited land, the potato made economic sense, but the potato also required replanting every year, while skirret returned on its own. The trade-off was between higher immediate yield and long-term self-sufficiency, and European agriculture chose yield. Skirret also faced another problem that became critical as farming began to mechanize during the 19th century. A machine designed to pull carrots or potatoes from the ground, one large root per plant, cannot handle a crop that grows in irregular clusters of 12 thin roots tangled together at a central crown. Skirret requires hands, and hands cost money. By the time industrial agriculture had reorganized itself around mechanical efficiency, skirret had already been pushed to the margins, surviving only in a few heritage seed collections and the gardens of people who remembered it from childhood. The second vegetable that medieval Europe relied on was even more versatile than skirret, because it functioned as 3 different crops depending on when and how it was harvested. Good King Henry grew beside nearly every cottage door in medieval England from the 1200s through the 1600s, and the reason for its ubiquity was simple. It produced 3 different vegetables from a single plant that came back stronger every year. In early spring, the young shoots could be cut and eaten like asparagus. Through summer, the leaves were harvested and cooked like spinach. In late summer, the flower buds were steamed and eaten like broccoli. The plant was a perennial that required no replanting, no fertilization, and no particular care beyond an occasional harvest. What made Good King Henry especially valuable to medieval households was its ability to grow in conditions that would kill most modern vegetables. It thrived in compacted soil, clay-heavy ground, and rocky patches where other crops struggled to establish themselves. In fact, historical records suggest it actually preferred soil that had been walked on and packed down, which is why it appeared so frequently along pathways and beside doorsteps where foot traffic kept the ground firm. The Metropolitan Museum's research on medieval monastery gardens notes that Good King Henry was cultivated as a potherb across monastic communities, and pollen evidence analyzed by agricultural historians indicates the plant was in continuous use in Britain from medieval times forward, suggesting it had become a reliable staple rather than an occasional novelty. The plant also produced significantly more edible material per square meter than modern spinach, because a single established clump could be harvested repeatedly throughout the growing season for 10 to 15 years without replanting. But Good King Henry had one characteristic that made it incompatible with the agricultural systems that developed during the 18th and 19th centuries. It grows slowly. A plant started from seed will not produce a harvestable crop until the second year, and it reaches full productivity only in the 3rd or 4th season. Modern spinach, by contrast, can be planted, grown, harvested, and delivered to market within 45 days. When agriculture began prioritizing speed and rapid turnover, a vegetable that required patience became economically unviable, regardless of how much food it eventually produced or how little maintenance it required once established. Good King Henry faded from cultivation, not because it stopped working, but because the system stopped waiting. The third vegetable that disappeared from European gardens had been introduced by the Romans more than 1,000 years earlier, and for most of that time it served as the primary celery substitute across northern Europe. Alexanders arrived in Britain with the Romans and remained the standard celery-like vegetable in northern European kitchens for more than 1,000 years before being replaced almost overnight by a crop that could survive the journey from farm to market without bruising. The plant is a biennial that produces dark green stems with a flavor stronger and more complex than modern celery, somewhere between celery and parsley with a slightly peppery finish. Every part of the plant was used in medieval cooking. The stems were blanched and eaten like celery. The leaves went into soups and stews. The roots were roasted, and even the flower buds were pickled. Alexanders grew wild along coastlines and near monastery walls throughout the Middle Ages, and historical records from monastic communities indicate it was deliberately cultivated in kitchen gardens as a reliable source of flavoring and bulk for pottage, the thick vegetable stew that formed the basis of the medieval diet. The plant handled conditions that would destroy most garden vegetables, thriving in salt spray, coastal wind, and chalky alkaline soil where other crops struggled. Once established, it self-seeded so aggressively that monastery records from the medieval period describe having to control its spread rather than encourage it, which suggests it required almost no maintenance once it had naturalized in a location. When Italian celery was introduced to northern Europe during the 1700s, Alexander's disappeared from cultivation within a few decades. The reason was not flavor, because contemporary accounts suggest Alexander's had a richer and more distinctive taste. The reason was logistics. Alexander's have hollow stems that bruise easily and collapse under pressure, which means they cannot be stacked in crates or transported over long distances without damage. Celery, with its denser structure and more uniform shape, could be harvested, packed, shipped by wagon or boat, and sold days later still looking fresh. As food distribution systems expanded and markets began sourcing vegetables from greater distances, the crops that survived the journey replaced the crops that did not, regardless of which ones grew more easily or tasted better. The fourth vegetable that medieval farmers valued was grown not only for its food, but for what it did to the soil while it was growing. Scorzonera was cultivated in Spain by the 17th century as both a food crop and a medicinal plant, and medieval physicians prescribed it for digestive complaints based on centuries of observation that people who ate it regularly seemed to recover from illness more quickly and experienced fewer stomach problems. The root itself is long and black-skinned, reaching up to 30 centimeters in length and growing straight down into the soil like a narrow spike. When peeled and cooked, it tastes remarkably similar to oysters, which is why it became known across 5 European languages as the oyster plant, a name that reflected genuine flavor rather than metaphor. What made Scorzonera particularly valuable to medieval farmers was not just the edible root, but what the plant did while it was growing. The deep taproot broke through compacted clay and hardpan layers that shallow-rooted crops could not penetrate, creating channels that improved drainage and allowed water to move deeper into the soil profile. As the root grew, it pulled minerals up from subsoil layers that other plants could not reach, and when the plant was harvested, those minerals remained in the upper soil where the next crop could access them. Medieval farmers used Scorzonera as a rotation crop specifically because it improved the ground for whatever was planted afterward, which meant it served a dual function as both food and soil management. The plant also contains high levels of inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria, which may explain why medieval physicians observed digestive benefits, even though they had no way to measure or understand the underlying biochemistry. Scorzonera faded from widespread cultivation for the same reason as skirret. It grows slowly, taking more than 4 months to reach harvestable size, and its irregular shape made it difficult to standardize for commercial sale. Modern agriculture needed crops that could be graded, sorted, and packaged uniformly, and a root that varied in length, thickness, and curvature from plant to plant did not fit that requirement. The fifth vegetable that disappeared from European gardens was valuable enough in medieval Germany that it inspired one of the most famous fairy tales ever written. The brothers Grimm did not invent the name Rapunzel for their fairy tale. They borrowed it from a vegetable that was common enough in German and French medieval gardens that their audience would have recognized it immediately. Rapunzel is the German word for rampion, a biennial plant that produces a white turnip-like root and edible leaves, both of which were eaten raw in salads or cooked like a mild radish. What made rampion especially important to medieval households was its ability to provide fresh food during the coldest months of the year when almost everything else in the garden had been harvested, preserved, or killed by frost. The plant grows through cold weather that would destroy modern lettuce, handling frost, light snow, and the short days of winter without bolting or turning bitter. German monastery records from the 1400s list rampion as a required planting in every kitchen garden, which suggests the monks understood that without it there would be no source of fresh greens between November and March, a 4-month period when the root cellar was running low and spring planting was still weeks away. For medieval families, rampion filled a critical gap in the seasonal food supply that few other crops could manage. The plant disappeared from widespread cultivation because it requires a full year to grow from seed to harvestable root, while modern radishes reach maturity in 25 days. When markets began demanding faster crop cycles and more frequent harvests, a vegetable that needed 12 months to produce food could not compete with one that produced food in less than a month, even though rampion provided fresh nutrition during a season when radishes could not grow at all. The speed advantage of modern crops eliminated the seasonal logic that had made rampion valuable in the first place. The sixth vegetable that medieval farmers grew was unusual because it thrived in soil so damaged by salt contamination that no other food crop would even germinate. Agretti, also known as salola or barilla, grew naturally in the salt marshes and coastal areas of Mediterranean Europe, particularly along the shores of Spain, southern France, and Italy, where it thrived in conditions that would kill nearly every other vegetable. The plant is a succulent with grass-like stems that taste naturally salty because it absorbs sodium directly from the soil and stores it in its tissue, which means it requires no added salt when cooked and can be eaten raw with a mineral bite similar to green beans. Medieval farmers in coastal regions discovered that agretti could be planted on land ruined by salt contamination, fields flooded by seawater, areas with naturally high salinity, or ground where salt accumulation had made normal agriculture impossible. And after several seasons of growing agretti, the soil would become usable again for other crops. The plant was performing what modern environmental scientists call phytoremediation, using its natural ability to absorb and concentrate sodium to gradually remove salt from the surrounding soil, though medieval farmers simply observed that land planted with agretti eventually supported vegetables that had previously failed there. This gave agretti a triple function. It fed the household, it healed damaged land, and the dried plant could be burned to produce soda ash, a sodium carbonate compound that became a key ingredient in Venetian glassmaking for centuries. One crop growing on otherwise worthless ground generated 3 separate economic outputs without requiring irrigation, fertilizer, or any input beyond the original planting. Agretti disappeared from mainstream agriculture because it cannot be stored or shipped. The stems begin losing their characteristic crunch within hours of harvest, and there is no way to package the plant, transport it across a region, and sell it days later while it still retains the texture and flavor that make it worth eating. It is a harvest-and-eat-today vegetable in a food system built around harvest-and-sell-next-week logistics, and that incompatibility eliminated it from commercial production, regardless of its other advantages. The seventh and final vegetable that fed medieval Europe was so common during the Middle Ages that it appeared in nearly every cooking pot, and then it vanished so completely that most people today have never heard its name. Orach was one of the most commonly grown vegetables in medieval Europe, appearing in gardens from the Mediterranean to Scandinavia, and historical evidence suggests it had been cultivated around the Mediterranean for roughly 4,000 years before spinach arrived, and replaced it almost entirely within a few generations. The plant grows tall, often reaching 2 meters in height, and produces leaves in a striking range of colors including deep red, purple, gold, and green, all of which can be eaten raw in salads or cooked as a potherb. What made orach particularly reliable for medieval farmers was its ability to handle conditions that cause modern spinach to fail. Spinach bolts and turns bitter in hot weather, wilts rapidly after picking, and requires consistent moisture to produce tender leaves. Orach, by contrast, continues producing edible leaves through summer heat, maintains its texture for days after harvest, and tolerates drought, frost, and poor soil without significant loss of productivity. A single plant produces far more edible material than an entire row of modern spinach, and because orach self-seeds aggressively, one planting can establish a permanent patch that returns every year without human intervention. Within 3 seasons, a gardener can have a self-maintaining supply of cooking greens that requires no watering, no feeding, and no replanting. Spinach replaced orach not because it tasted better or grew more easily, but because it fit the requirements of commercial agriculture more cleanly. Spinach is short, uniform in appearance, and can be harvested, bagged, and sold in standardized portions. Orach is tall, varies in color and leaf shape from plant to plant, and looks different every time it grows, which makes it impossible to package in a way that meets the visual consistency standards of modern produce aisles. The market needed vegetables that looked identical, and Auroch refused to cooperate. These 7 vegetables, Skirret, Good King Henry, Alexander's, Scorzonera, Rampion, Agretti, and Auroch, shared a set of characteristics that made them valuable in medieval agriculture, but incompatible with the system that replaced it. They were perennials, or aggressive self-seeders that returned year after year from a single planting. They improved or maintained soil quality rather than depleting it. They required minimal external inputs, and they tolerated poor conditions that would kill most modern crops. But they also shared characteristics that made them difficult to integrate into the agricultural systems that developed during the 18th and 19th centuries. They grew slowly, often requiring a full year or more to reach productivity. They produced irregular shapes and sizes that could not be easily graded or standardized. They had short shelf lives after harvest, making long-distance transport difficult or impossible. And most critically, they could not be harvested by machine. Medieval agriculture valued permanence, resilience, and self-sufficiency because labor was limited, external inputs were expensive, and the ability to grow food without constant replanting represented a significant economic advantage. Modern agriculture inverted those priorities. Speed became more valuable than permanence because faster crop cycles allowed more harvests per season. Uniformity became more valuable than diversity because standardized products could be mechanically processed and efficiently distributed. Durability and transport became more valuable than flavor or nutrition because expanding markets required crops that could survive days or weeks between harvest and sale. This was not a conspiracy to suppress useful plants, but an economic transformation driven by the logic of industrial scale, mechanized production, and centralized distribution. The crops that survived were the ones that fit the new system, and the crops that disappeared were the ones that did not, regardless of how well they had performed under previous conditions. Potatoes replaced skirret because they produced more calories per hectare and presented a single large tuber instead of a tangled cluster. Spinach replaced Good King Henry and Auroch because it matured in weeks instead of years and could be harvested, bagged, and sold in uniform portions. Celery replaced Alexander's because it survived shipping without bruising. The medieval vegetables did not fail. They succeeded at something the market stopped rewarding. In recent years, some of these crops have begun reappearing in heritage seed catalogs and small-scale gardens, driven by growing interest in perennial food systems, soil health, and reduced dependence on external inputs. They are not returning because modern agriculture has failed, but because the conditions that made perennial vegetables valuable in medieval times are becoming relevant again in different contexts. Climate stress is making resilience more important than it was during the stable weather patterns of the 20th century. Soil degradation in intensive agricultural regions is renewing interest in crops that improve ground quality rather than depleting it. Rising costs for fertilizers, pesticides, and fuel are making low-input systems more economically attractive. And home gardeners, small farms, and communities focused on local food production are rediscovering that perennial vegetables reduce labor, eliminate the need for annual seed purchases, and produce food in conditions where annual crops struggle. These medieval crops will not replace modern agriculture, and they were never intended to. Industrial farming feeds billions of people through high-yield annual crops, mechanized efficiency, and global distribution networks that perennial vegetables cannot match at scale. But in gardens, small farms, and resilience-focused systems, the logic that made skirret, Good King Henry, Alexander's, Scorzonera, Rampion, Agretti, and Auroch valuable for centuries still holds. A perennial that produces food for 10 years from one planting requires less soil disturbance, fewer external inputs, and less recurring cost than an annual replanted every season. A self-seeding biennial that returns without human intervention reduces dependence on seed suppliers and eliminates one entire step in the growing cycle. A crop that improves soil while producing food creates value that extends beyond the harvest itself. Behind the stone walls of the monastery of Pedralbes, the garden that has been growing since 1327 was recently restored as part of an effort to preserve knowledge of medieval agricultural practices. The vegetables planted there are not museum pieces or historical curiosities. They are functional crops that fed communities for centuries, disappeared when the economic system changed, and survived at the margins because a few gardeners, seed savers, and small farmers continued growing them even after the market stopped valuing what they did. Forgotten does not mean useless. It means the system moved on, and what the system left behind may still contain knowledge worth recovering.